Michael fought for equality both on and off the track, but no one expected that his most important victory would spark a scandal that would tear the sports system apart from within. When his success became a symbol of the fight against discrimination, some of his fiercest fans turned into his worst enemies. How did his triumph become a threat to everything he loved, and what did he do to face it? Let's start from the very beginning. Michael stood at the entrance to the Olympic Stadium, his heart pounding in his chest, his breathing ragged. At this moment, he should have felt pride and confidence. After all, this was his first international competition, a huge step forward in his career. But instead, he felt the cold stares that seemed to pierce right through him. The judges walking past him didn't hide their disdain, and some of his colleagues whispered to each other, casting disdainful glances his way. "I'm not here by accident," Michael repeated to himself, trying to shake off the weight of hostile looks and insinuations. But the whispers were too loud. "That black guy thinks he can compete? There's no place here for people like him." This thought seeped into his consciousness like poison, eroding his confidence. Michael took a deep breath, looking down at his hands. They were strong, muscular, the result of years of training, pain, and sacrifice. He had fought for every opportunity, for every minute on the track, and now, on the verge of the greatest moment of his life, everything around him reminded him that the world was not ready to accept him as he was. "I have to do this," he repeated to himself, remembering his mother's face, who always taught him that the fight for a place in life was not just about physical victory, but about triumph over prejudice. But today, Michael felt trapped, as if his achievements had already been devalued in advance. Flashes of memories crossed Michael's mind. School competitions where he was always perceived as a threat, training sessions where he had to prove his worth even to his own coaches. And now, on this international stage, it was all coming back with renewed force. His body was ready for the challenge, but his spirit was torn by doubt and anger at the injustice. His coach approached and patted him on the shoulder. "Michael, this is your chance. Don't think about them. Think about why you're here." Michael nodded, but inside, a storm was raging. He didn't just need to win. He needed to prove that he belonged there. But how could he focus when every mistake would be seen as confirmation of their contempt? As the first race began, Michael felt his muscles tense with anticipation. The starting gun went off, and he shot out like an arrow from a bow. The whole world disappeared, leaving only the sound of his steps and the rhythm of his breathing. For this brief moment, there were no judges, no spectators, just the track and his will. His body moved smoothly, like a well-oiled machine, but inside, the words spoken before the race still burned. A fluke, that's what they would say if he won. He felt it, knew that his victory would never be fully recognized. But could he allow them to rob him of this moment? He clenched his teeth and picked up the pace. He crossed the finish line first. The cheers of his team and fans echoed loudly, but when his eyes met one of the judges, the joy faded. The judge didn't hide his displeasure. His eyes said, "You don't belong here." Michael breathed heavily, trying to collect his thoughts. Inside, anger boiled. Why did every step he took have to be accompanied by doubt? Why did his success have to be questioned just because of the color of his skin? He looked at his coach, who nodded in approval, but Michael couldn't share that feeling. It seemed that everything he had accomplished was devalued in the eyes of those around him. After the race, one of his colleagues approached him, smirking. "Well, Michael, got lucky this time, huh?" These words, spoken with obvious mockery, ignited a wave of indignation inside Michael. "It's not luck!" His voice sounded firm, but inside, emotions raged. "I earned this place just like you." "We'll see how much more luck you'll need," the colleague replied, and Michael felt a growing sense of frustration. Every time he achieved something, it was perceived as a fluke, as an exception to the rules. The climax came unexpectedly. After the race, the judge, the one who had looked at him with disdain, approached the team, clearly not hiding his dissatisfaction. "Well, I still think these results aren't a true reflection of strength," he said, glancing at Michael. His voice was dripping with skepticism. At that moment, the whole world around Michael seemed to freeze. He locked eyes with the judges and the spectators, who had begun to voice their support. The outrage among the fans was growing, and his team loudly expressed their dissatisfaction. For Michael, this was a turning point. He realized that the fight for justice wasn't just about his victories on the track, but about standing up to the prejudices that pursued him every day. He stepped forward, feeling the anger fueling him. But this anger had become his strength. He couldn't allow those words to destroy his drive. "I'm not here to prove my worth to you. I'm here to show that fairness and equality matter in everything, even if you're not ready to accept it," Michael said, his voice steadier than ever. The crowd fell silent. This moment wasn't just a personal victory for him. It was the beginning of his long journey toward something bigger, toward changes in sports, in the perception of black athletes, and in the fight for equality. Michael felt the immense responsibility on his shoulders, and now he was ready to bear that weight. Before the second race, Michael felt out of place. He stood near the track, tensely stretching his legs, but his mind was far from physical preparation. Around him, there was the usual hustle, athletes warming up, coaches giving last-minute advice. But Michael sensed that the focus wasn't on the competition, but on him. Nearby, just loud enough for him to hear, coaches from other teams were discussing him. "This guy's got the physical strength, but he's clearly lacking brains," said one of the coaches. "His wins are pure luck, nothing to do with skill. Guys like him don't last long," added another. Their words cut deep, sending a cold wave of isolation through Michael's soul. He knew this wasn't an accident. Comments like these always surfaced when a black athlete was at the top. Michael felt his hands clenching into fists. His mind was flooded with thoughts. Why do they say these things? Why, even if I win, is my victory always devalued? Michael lowered his head, trying not to pay attention to the conversation. He focused on his training, remembering every drop of sweat he had shed to be here. But instead of building confidence, anxiety was burning inside him. What if they were right? What if everything he was doing was just luck? He knew he was physically ready, but what if his mental strength failed him at this crucial moment? "You shouldn't listen to them," Michael reminded himself, as if trying to convince himself. He had always told himself that it didn't matter what others thought of him. What mattered were his actions. But when every word was aimed at tearing him down, even the strongest person could waver. Looking at the track, Michael felt a strange heaviness in his chest. He wasn't just under the pressure of expectations. He was under the weight of racial hatred that seeped into every competition. He couldn't afford to lose. It would be equivalent to defeat in a much larger battle for justice. When Michael lined up at the starting line, he felt as though everyone around him was watching his every move. The attention directed at him wasn't support, but a heavy burden of judgment. The judges exchanged glances, clearly suggesting that his presence at this competition was an accident. Michael tried to focus, but his thoughts kept returning to the words he had overheard from the coaches. He heard someone quietly laugh behind him, and his body tensed up. What if they're right? What if I really don't deserve to be here? These thoughts crept into his mind like poison, undermining the confidence he had built over the years. He knew that in moments like this, he needed to pull himself together and push forward, but the doubts were growing too strong. The sound of the starting gun went off, and Michael shot forward. But something was wrong. His steps were slower than usual, his breathing heavier. Every step felt like a struggle. In his mind, the voices of the critics, the judges, the coaches, all those who had ever doubted his abilities, echoed relentlessly. He began to feel himself losing momentum, falling behind. One of the competitors passed him, and Michael felt a cold stab in his chest. He couldn't believe he was letting himself fall behind. "No, focus," he told himself, trying to regain control over his body. But the voice inside was too strong, the doubts too deep. When his coach shouted, "Michael, faster!" it sounded like a distant echo from another world. Michael had lost his concentration, and his body stopped obeying. He watched as one competitor after another overtook him, as he lost precious seconds, along with his faith in himself. When Michael crossed the finish line, his heart was pounding, not just from physical exhaustion, but from disappointment. He knew he had lost, not only the race, but also the battle with his inner demons. The judges, coaches, and spectators looked at him with disapproval, as if his failure had confirmed their opinions. He stopped, breathing heavily, and looked at the crowd. In some people's eyes, he saw mockery. Others just turned away indifferently. This wasn't just a loss on the track. It was a defeat in the fight for justice he had been fighting since the beginning of his career. Michael approached his coach, who looked at him with clear bewilderment. "What happened, Michael?" "You lost focus," the coach said, but there was no judgment in his voice. Michael looked at him, and at that moment he realized that physical preparation was only part of his battle. His real struggle was in his mind, where racial prejudices and societal pressure were wearing down his strength. I just couldn't do it," Michael whispered, unsure how to explain his feelings. He felt broken, but at the same time, he realized that his fight was just beginning. This wasn't just a competition on the track. It was a battle for the right to be seen, to be respected. He couldn't allow himself to break down because of one loss. "This isn't the end," he quietly told himself, clenching his fists. "I can't give up now. This is just one step in a long journey." He felt a new resolve growing inside him. His defeat had become a lesson. He understood that his inner strength was more important than any physical victory. To win this fight, he would need not only to train his body, but also to defend his belief in himself, despite the judgment of those around him. Michael sat on the bench at the edge of the stadium, watching other athletes train. His body still felt the tension from the previous race, but the physical pain seemed insignificant compared to the emotional turmoil inside him. He had lost, not just a race, but the inner battle with his demons, racism, contempt, and doubt. It wasn't his first loss, but each time, the same pains cut deeper. The stadium was full of people, but he felt utterly alone. He heard faint whispers behind him, thin threads of mockery aimed straight at his soul. "That black guy clearly overestimated his abilities." A voice from the crowd reached his ears. He clenched his fists, but didn't turn around. It seemed like the whole world was waiting for his weakness, waiting for him to lose control. Michael felt the tension rising within him as his body and mind fought the involuntary response to humiliation. One of the fans, walking by, loudly said while looking directly at him, "You don't belong here." The words hit like a stone, and Michael froze for a moment. His fingers clenched so tightly into fists that he felt his nails digging into his palms. He wanted to lash out, to release the fury that had built up inside him. But what would that accomplish? They were only waiting for him to show his weakness, to confirm their biased expectations. "Hold on," Michael reminded himself. But how long could he endure this pressure? How many more times could he face these insults while pretending not to care? His heart beat unevenly, each thud echoing with pain. He was one of the best in his country, But what did that mean in the eyes of those who only saw the color of his skin? Returning to his team, Michael hoped to find support, but as soon as he entered the locker room, he was met with restrained glances. The coach stood by the wall, grimly reviewing the race results. The guys from the team were chatting amongst themselves, but as soon as Michael walked in, the conversations abruptly stopped. He felt that even among his own, he was becoming a stranger. "Not bad for your first race," the coach finally said, not lifting his eyes. There was no approval or support in his voice, just a cold, professional statement of fact. Michael bit his lip, unsure of what to say. He had always thought of the coach as his mentor, but at that moment, he realized that even in his eyes, he wasn't considered an equal. "You should have run faster," added one of his teammates with obvious disdain. "We can't afford slip-ups like that." Michael turned to face the speaker. It was Josh, one of the team's most successful athletes. His words were filled with a veiled accusation, and Michael felt another wave of anger rise inside him. "I did everything I could," Michael replied, trying to keep his voice steady, though inside he was boiling. Josh just smirked. "If that's all you're capable of, you don't belong here." Those words stung like a whip, as if they carried the same hatred he'd heard from the stands. Michael felt that even among his own team, he remained an outsider. The sense of injustice grew with every passing moment. He wasn't just an athlete, he was a symbol that it was possible to win despite prejudice. But what do you do when even those you considered your own start doubting you? The next race was critically important for Michael. He needed to prove to everyone, and to himself, that he had earned his place here. But as soon as he lined up on the starting line again, he felt the stares around him burning into his back. Everyone was waiting for him to fall. Michael knew that they didn't believe in him. They believed in his failure, in the idea that a black athlete couldn't stay at the top. When the judge gave the starting signal, Michael shot forward. In his mind, there was nothing but the sound of his breathing and the thudding of his heart. He felt that he had to run, not just for victory, but to break down the walls built around him. But everything changed when he heard the judge's words. "That's a violation of the rules." Michael stumbled for a moment, losing his rhythm. Violation? He couldn't understand what was wrong, but before he could comprehend anything, the judge raised his hand, stopping him. "You're disqualified," the judge coldly announced. At that moment, the crowd erupted in joyful cheers, as if his failure was a cause for celebration. Michael stood there, not believing his ears. The crowd was jubilant, his team was silent, and the judges didn't even try to hide their satisfaction. He felt as if the ground had been ripped out from under him. He had been robbed of his right to victory, without even being given the chance to explain himself. This wasn't just a sports defeat. It was proof that his skin color would always be a reason for some to consider him unworthy. But something inside Michael didn't break. He raised his head, locked eyes with the judges and the crowd, and felt a new strength rising within him. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. He realized that his fight would be much longer than he had thought, and that the disqualification was just another barrier on his path to true justice. "You think you've stopped me," he quietly said to himself, clenching his fists, "but you've only given me more reason to fight." Michael understood that his victories would not only be on the track, but also in the minds of people who weren't yet ready to recognize him as an equal. And he was ready to keep going, despite everything that lay ahead. Michael sat in front of the camera in a brightly lit studio, but despite the warm light shining on his face, he felt a deep, cold emptiness inside. Across from him, a live interview was about to begin, where he was supposed to speak about the struggles that had plagued him for months. His hands rested on his knees, trembling slightly from tension, and his gaze seemed lost in the distance. A whirlwind of thoughts spun through his mind. "Are you ready?" the producer called from across the studio. Michael nodded, even though deep down he felt there was no way to truly prepare for this. A candid discussion about racism in sports, about the discrimination he had faced, was a risky move. He knew that many people didn't want to hear the truth, and understood that after this interview, everything would change. "Let's begin," the host said, and the camera zoomed in on Michael's face. He began to speak, cautiously at first, as though testing the waters. He talked about his early steps in the sport, the challenges, and the victories that had felt real only until racist remarks and humiliations overshadowed them. Then his voice grew firmer. Michael spoke about the judges who had treated his performances unfairly, the coaches who saw him only for his strength, not his talent, and how every time he succeeded, his achievements were diminished because of his skin color. "This isn't just about me," he continued. "This is a systemic issue we live in. I can't stay silent when my brothers and sisters in sports face the same struggles I do." His words hung in the air, filling the studio with tension. Michael knew this was a moment of truth, that there was no turning back. The camera kept rolling, and his voice grew louder and more confident. Every time he encountered injustice, his internal struggle intensified. But now he felt that he could change not only his fate, but also the lives of others. The next day after the interview aired, Michael immediately felt the impact his words had on the media. Social media blew up with messages, feedback, and comments, pouring in like an avalanche. Most of the comments were supportive, but among them were voices trying to tarnish his name. Articles began to appear in various outlets, some praising his courage, others condemning him. Michael had expected criticism, but not the brutal campaign against him. One newspaper ran a headline, "Athlete or provocateur, Michael seeks excuses for his losses." Another outlet labeled his statements baseless, claiming he was merely seeking attention after his recent failures in competition. Michael sat at home, holding his tablet, scrolling through all these articles. He felt bitterness growing inside him. "They just don't want to see the truth," he whispered to himself. But it hurt. The words sank deep into his mind, and he couldn't ignore how his intentions were being questioned. At that moment, there was a knock at the door. It was his coach. "Michael, you know this won't blow over quietly," the coach began as they sat down at the kitchen table. "People are going to turn everything against you. They already are. Are you ready for that?" Michael dropped his gaze. "I don't know," he admitted, feeling the weight of his words. "I wanted to do the right thing, but it seems like everything is going wrong." The coach looked at him intently. "Justice doesn't come easily. You've started a fight that requires patience and strength. You know what you're doing is right, and that's what matters. Don't let them knock you off course." The coach's words gave Michael a sense of strength, but deep down, he still had doubts. Society's eyes were turned against him, and each new day felt like a fresh battle. The following week, Michael took another hit. One evening, after coming home from training, he found a new letter in his mailbox. It was an official document from one of his major sponsors. The letter stated that the sponsor was terminating their partnership with him, citing negative media coverage and damage to the brand's image. Michael felt his world collapsing once again. He read the letter over and over, unable to believe his eyes. It was so unfair. He had fought for truth, for equality, but now he was being punished for it. He sat at the table, holding the letter in his hands, and his mind raced. "So this is what happens when you try to speak the truth," he thought. His hands began to shake again from anger and helplessness. This was the moment that would have broken many, but not Michael. He stood up, paced around the room, and grabbed his phone. He needed to make an important call to the journalist who had requested another interview. This time, Michael wanted to talk about what happens when you raise your voice against the system. It wasn't just his battle, it was the battle of thousands of people facing discrimination. When the journalist picked up, Michael spoke with unwavering determination. "I'm ready to talk again. This time, I'll tell the whole story." He knew this fight wouldn't end easily, but now he was sure that his voice wasn't just important for him. It was for all those who felt cornered by a system that refused to see them. Michael was prepared to go all the way, no matter the losses and pressure. He understood that justice doesn't come easily, but he wasn't about to give up. Michael sat at the edge of his bed, his phone lying on the nightstand, vibrating constantly with new messages. The screen was lit with hundreds of comments, where support was mixed with brutal criticism. Some words hit like sharp blows. "Traitor," "seeking pity," "you're just an athlete, not fit to judge." He scrolled down the screen, and each new message seemed to add another weight to his shoulders. The threats were becoming more explicit. "We know where you live," one user wrote. "You better stay quiet if you don't want trouble," another warned. Michael threw the phone aside, closing his eyes and taking a deep breath. He had always been taught to ignore the hate, but this hate now felt too close. Michael realized that after his interview, the sports world had changed for him. He had exposed a long-standing issue, and now those comfortable with the status quo were lashing out at him. He knew that now he was seen as more than just an athlete. He had become a symbol of the fight for equality, but that didn't make his internal struggle any easier. A knock on the door. It was his manager. His face looked grim. "Michael, you need to think about what you're doing," he began without preamble. "You're an athlete. You should focus on your career, not politics." Michael felt the anger rising inside him. "Do you think this is just politics?" he asked, standing up. "This is not just about sports. It's about how we, black athletes, constantly face injustice." The manager sighed, as if knowing his words would not be met with understanding. "You could lose everything if you continue. You already see how people are reacting. You need to stop before it's too late." Michael closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the struggle within becoming unbearable. He knew his path would be difficult, but could he afford to stay silent? The next day, the tension only grew. Training felt endless, but Michael's thoughts were far from running. Every move felt mechanical, and every second, his mind clashed with a new wave of doubt. After practice, he met with the team, hoping to find even a drop of support. The coach approached him, looking into his eyes with an unusual sternness. "Michael, do you understand the consequences?" he began. "I understand your desire to speak the truth, but you have a career. You need to think about the sport." "I can't just forget what I'm going through," Michael responded, feeling his words gaining strength. "I see how we are judged differently, how they try to put us in our place. If I stay silent, I'll betray myself and those who support me." "This is not the way," the coach softly countered. "You can be a great athlete, Michael. It's not worth destroying everything for this." Michael clenched his fists, feeling the despair building. He was disappointed that even those close to him couldn't see the bigger picture. For them, it was all about the sport, about wins and losses. But for Michael, it was more. It was a fight for justice, for the right to equality not only on the track, but in life. "I've made my choice," he finally said, his voice quiet but resolute. "If it means I lose everything for the truth, so be it." The coach sighed, understanding that Michael wouldn't change his decision. It was a break not only with the managers and coach, but also with those who saw him only as an athlete, forgetting that he was a person with principles and battles of his own. A week later, the news came that Michael had expected, but it still hit harder than he had anticipated. One of his biggest sponsors terminated the contract. They did it publicly to distance themselves from the scandal surrounding Michael. The official statement read, "We have always supported athletic achievements, not political statements. We can no longer continue our partnership with Michael." When Michael read those words, he was overwhelmed by a sense of loss. This wasn't just a sponsorship contract. It was a recognition that speaking the truth came at a high cost. He sat in his small living room, surrounded by silence that now seemed deafening. He knew it was inevitable, but he still felt the pain of knowing that his refusal to stay silent had cost him an important part of his career. Late that evening, his mother called. She had always been his support, and Michael felt how much he needed her words. "You made the right choice," she said quietly. "Even if it's hard now, you've given many people hope. People look at you and see that it's possible to fight, even when everything seems against you." Her words warmed his heart, and Michael felt that despite all the losses, his path was the right one. He had lost sponsors, and he might lose his career, but he had not lost himself, and that was the most important thing. "I'm more than just an athlete," he said softly, gazing out the window at the slow-falling evening rain. "I can't just close my eyes to injustice. If I have to fight, then I'll fight for all of us." Michael sat at his kitchen table, staring at the pile of letters and messages that had accumulated over the past few days. Many of them were filled with insults and anger, but among these dark lines was one letter that caught his attention. The envelope was simple, without any extra markings, and judging by the handwriting, the sender was young. Opening the letter, Michael began to read. "Michael, you probably don't know me, but your story changed my life. I'm just a beginner athlete, and before your interview, I thought I couldn't succeed in this sport. I often face being underestimated just because of my skin color. But when I heard you talk about the discrimination you had to endure, I realized I wasn't alone. Your words gave me the strength to keep fighting. Thank you for not staying silent." Michael froze, rereading the letter several times. His heart tightened, and tears briefly gathered at the edges of his eyes, though he held them back. This letter, unlike most others, wasn't filled with malice or threats. It was a sincere, heartfelt message from a young man who found in Michael's story something more than just sports inspiration. He felt that his struggle had meaning. The letter served as a reminder that his efforts were important, not only for himself, but for an entire generation of athletes facing the same challenges. His heart filled with pride, but also with a new sense of responsibility. He couldn't let down those who saw him as a role model. The next day, Michael couldn't get the letter out of his head. He sat in his training room, surrounded by the familiar sounds of pounding on the treadmill and the shouts of coaches, but his thoughts were elsewhere. His world of sports was no longer just about personal achievements. He felt he had to do something more, to help other young athletes like the boy who had written to him. Michael met with his old friend Jason, another black athlete who had long been trying to start a support program for young athletes. "I want to join your initiative," Michael said as they sat down at a cafe table after training. "I need something more than just sports." Jason raised his eyebrows in surprise, but his face quickly lit up with a smile. "Are you serious?" he asked. "This will be a huge step. Are you ready for it?" "I'm ready," Michael responded confidently. "After everything I've been through, I realized my struggle isn't just about my personal victories. I want young athletes to know that they're not alone, that they can fight and win, despite the discrimination." They discussed plans for hours, and by the end of the conversation, Michael felt he had found a new purpose. He was no longer just an athlete striving for medals. He was becoming a leader of a movement, a symbol of hope for those facing the same challenges he had. His decision wasn't easy, but it felt right. A few weeks after beginning his work with the charity, Michael was invited to speak at a public event dedicated to fighting discrimination in sports. It was a charity event attended not only by athletes, but also by young people seeking inspiration. Michael felt a wave of nervous tension before the speech. He was already used to talking about equality and justice, but now he felt that his words needed not just to touch hearts, but to change the lives of those who listened. When he stepped onto the stage, the bright spotlights blinded him for a moment, but he gathered his thoughts, recalling the letter he had received from the young athlete. Michael began to speak. When I first encountered racism in sports, I was only 16. Back then, I thought it was a temporary obstacle, that if I was good enough, I would be recognized. But over the years, I realized that it's not just about skills or victories. It's about a system that is set up against us. And this isn't just about sports. It's about life. Michael felt the crowd go silent, listening closely to his words. He spoke not only of his story, but also of those athletes who fight against injustice without finding support. He saw understanding, compassion, and even tears in the eyes of some. But I stand here today not to complain, Michael continued. I stand here to tell you, we can change the system. We can make sure that every young athlete, no matter what color they are, knows that their efforts and victories are valued equally. I know how hard it is to do that, but we must fight. His speech ended with loud applause. He saw how the young people in the audience reacted to his words with enthusiasm. Some approached him after the speech to thank him for the inspiration, but most importantly, Michael knew that his words had touched those who thought they were fighting alone. Michael stood by the window, staring at the street, lost in his thoughts. Outside, the rain fell in soft drops, sliding down the glass like his thoughts, which flowed together in his head, mixing. The last few weeks had been particularly hard. Michael felt the sports world he had dedicated his life to slowly turning its back on him. What had started as a fight for justice had now become the reason for accusations and threats to his sports career. It all began when several major sports organizations publicly stated that Michael was creating unnecessary noise and stirring up conflicts. They called his actions political, claiming that sports should remain apolitical. Michael read these articles with pain in his heart. He understood that their position was an attempt to protect a system that upheld the status quo, where athletes, especially black athletes, were expected to remain silent and focus only on their achievements. Do they really think they can just ignore injustice? He asked himself mentally, feeling more and more disappointed. He knew he was right, but the pressure was growing. Now the threat of disqualification from major competitions hung over his head. He remembered the words of a sports official during a meeting a week ago. Michael, you're a good athlete, but you need to choose. Either you continue your career, or you continue your activism. You can't do both. Michael looked at the empty street outside the window and felt a storm rising inside him. How could someone be forced to choose between the truth and their life's passion? He knew this was not just a test of his athletic skills, but a test of his convictions. That evening, Michael headed to training. However, upon entering the hall, he immediately sensed that something had changed. The atmosphere was tense, as if the air was filled with distrust and fear. He noticed how his teammates avoided meeting his eyes. Some of them whispered, and when Michael got closer, the conversations stopped. He approached the coach, who was standing by the wall, checking the training list. The coach didn't even look up when Michael approached. Michael sighed and decided to speak first. I know what's happening, he began. They're trying to silence me, and it's affecting all of us. The coach lifted his gaze, his face impassive. Michael, you have to understand that your actions affect more than just you. Many in the team are afraid that your activism could impact their careers. Michael frowned. I'm not trying to hurt anyone. I'm fighting for justice, for us to be treated equally. This affects all of us. You may not realize it, but not everyone is willing to make such sacrifices, the coach quietly replied. Your teammates are afraid that your actions might cost them their places on the national team, and you could lose your career. The coach's words sounded reasonable, but inside, Michael's anger boiled. How could people put their careers above justice? He understood that the fear of losing jobs and opportunities made many people remain silent. But he couldn't. This wasn't just his personal fight. It was something bigger. I can't just stop, Michael said firmly, looking the coach in the eyes. If I give up, I'll betray everyone who believes in me and our shared struggle. The coach didn't respond, but his expression showed that he understood Michael had already made up his mind. A few days later, Michael received an official letter from the judging committee. It stated that his activism might lead to his disqualification from upcoming competitions if he didn't stop his political statements. This wasn't just a warning, it was an ultimatum. Either he stayed silent or he would lose his sports career. He sat in his office, holding the letter in his hands, feeling the ground slipping from under his feet. Everything he had worked for since childhood was now threatened because of his fight for equality. But could he abandon this fight? His phone rang. It was Jason. Did you get their letter? Jason asked, concern clear in his voice. Yeah, Michael replied quietly. They're threatening disqualification. And what are you going to do? Jason asked, his voice becoming serious. Michael froze for a second. This was the key moment. His entire future depended on this decision. But deep down, he knew the answer. He couldn't betray himself or those who believed in him. I can't give up, Jason, Michael said firmly. If they want to disqualify me for fighting for justice, so be it, but I won't stay silent. On the other end of the line, there was silence. Jason knew how important sports were to Michael, but he also understood that Michael would never compromise his principles. I'm proud of you, Jason finally said. You're doing what's right, even if it's hard. Michael felt a surge of strength in his soul. He knew difficult times were ahead, but he was ready. He realized that the fight for equality always faces resistance, especially from those who don't want change. But he was prepared to go all the way. Michael sat on the couch in his apartment, staring at his phone. The apartment was quiet, disturbed only by the distant hum of the city outside the windows. He hadn't received messages from friends or family in several days. This loneliness felt especially painful because his family had always been his support, and he could confide his most personal thoughts to them. Now, everything had changed. His fight for justice had become public. His voice had been heard. But the consequences of this battle began to tear apart his personal relationships. Those who had once supported him started to drift away. He knew they weren't rejecting him because of disagreements, but because they were afraid his activism might affect their lives. He understood that fear, but for Michael, it still hurt. He remembered a recent conversation with his mother. She had called him late one evening, and her voice sounded worried. Michael, you need to be careful. You know I've always supported you, but your actions are attracting too much attention. I'm worried about you. Mom, I can't stop, he had replied then. This is bigger than just my life. This is a fight for something important, for all of us. But even knowing how important his mission was, Michael couldn't ignore the overwhelming silence that now enveloped his personal life. He had lost touch with those who had once been his pillars of support. And although his actions resonated with many in society, he felt deeply alone. The next day, Michael went to training with a heavy heart. He was supposed to focus on physical tasks, but his thoughts were far from the track. Every step felt slower than usual. Every movement seemed drained of its usual energy. Even the coach noticed, approaching Michael after several failed attempts at running. "You're not in shape today," the coach said, looking him in the eyes. "What's going on?" Michael didn't know how to answer. Everything seemed tangled. His fight for equality, his sports career, his relationships with loved ones. He wanted to explain to the coach that his thoughts weren't on sports, but on how his activism was driving away the people he loved. But how do you explain that to someone whose only focus is on sports? "I'm just burned out," Michael finally answered, trying to avoid too much honesty. The coach nodded, but didn't seem satisfied with the response. "You have to make a choice, Michael," the coach continued softly but firmly. "You can't be halfway here and halfway there. Either you dedicate yourself to the fight or to the sport. You can't do both at the same time." Those words hit Michael hard. He understood that the coach was right, but how could he choose between two parts of his life? Sports had been his passion since childhood, but the fight for justice had become his mission. He found himself at a moral crossroads. Should he continue his public activism, risking his career and relationships, or return to his previous life and give up his beliefs for the sake of personal peace? A few days later, Michael received an unexpected invitation to speak at another charity event, this time dedicated to fighting racial discrimination in sports. He knew this would further widen the gap between him and his loved ones, but he couldn't refuse. This fight had become part of his essence. At the event, standing before a hall full of people, Michael felt a wave of doubt wash over him. He knew that his presence here meant a final decision. He was choosing activism and continuing his fight, even if it would lead to more personal sacrifices. But what would happen to his sports career? What would happen to his family and friends? Michael closed his eyes for a moment, recalling all the difficulties he had faced, remembering how injustice had led him down this path. His mother's worried voice echoed in his mind. He knew he was losing something important, but he also knew that his mission was not just his personal battle. When he began his speech, his voice was firm and confident. "My life has changed, and I stand before a choice that many of you understand. We must decide what is more important, our personal well-being or the fight for justice. I've decided that I can't close my eyes to injustice, even if it means losing everything I've worked for. I'm ready for that." His words echoed in the hall, filled with silence, but then applause followed. Michael looked at the faces in the crowd and saw support and understanding in them. He knew he had made the right decision. His mission was more important than his personal losses, and now, even though his path would be difficult, he was ready to go all the way. Michael stood in front of his laptop, staring at the screen in disbelief. Not long ago, he had felt isolated and alone in his fight, but now the situation had begun to change dramatically. Messages of support were flooding in one after another. Famous athletes, actors, and politicians, all were expressing their solidarity with Michael and his movement for equality in sports. He read a message from a well-known soccer player. "Michael, you're doing what many of us were afraid to do. We stand with you." Another letter was from a famous political activist who offered his help in promoting Michael's initiatives. Michael felt his heart beating faster. He knew these weren't just words. This was the first sign that his efforts hadn't been in vain. The loneliness that had haunted him recently was slowly fading, leaving room for hope. But along with the support came a new realization. He now carried an enormous responsibility. His fight was no longer just a personal matter. People looked to him as a leader. He looked again at the screen, reading one of the messages. "Your fight is our fight. We can't stay silent." These words touched him deeply. Now he felt he was finally not alone. A few weeks later, Michael held a press conference. Its purpose was clear: to communicate the demands of his movement to sports organizations and the public. He knew this moment would be pivotal. Earlier, his movement had been the movement of one man, but now he represented thousands of people who supported his ideals. The hall was packed with journalists, athletes, and activists. The atmosphere was tense. Michael felt it as a physical pressure on his shoulders. His hands trembled slightly, but inside he was calm. He knew he was speaking the truth. Today we stand here to say, sports can no longer be a place where discrimination and bias are the norm. He began his speech. We demand justice and equality for all athletes, regardless of their skin color. This movement no longer belongs to one person. This is a fight for everyone who believes in equality. After these words, loud applause followed. He saw his colleagues, the very people who had once feared for their careers, now standing behind him, shoulder to shoulder. Both black and white athletes had united in support of his cause, but with the support came a new threat. After the conference, representatives of sports organizations claimed that Michael's demands were destabilizing the sports industry and could damage its reputation. This was predictable, but Michael hadn't expected such a harsh response. It was clear to him that those in power were not going to give in easily. A month after the press conference, discussions began among sports authorities about reviewing discrimination policies. At first glance, it seemed like a huge success for Michael and his movement. But the internal forces of the sports system weren't surrendering so easily. Some officials publicly spoke out against the changes, claiming that racism in sports was not a systemic problem, and that Michael's actions were destroying the spirit of sports. This statement provoked a storm of public outrage, leading to even more protests. Michael knew the resistance would be strong, but he hadn't expected his own achievements to be used against him. Nevertheless, the wave of support continued to grow. Eventually, the sports authorities could no longer ignore the pressure. They announced the start of reforms aimed at eliminating racial bias in refereeing and increasing transparency in the selection of athletes. It was an important victory, but Michael knew it was only the beginning. When he heard the news, his heart filled with pride. He had accomplished something many thought was impossible. He had forced the system to begin changing. But along with the sense of victory came the realization that much work lay ahead. Michael now knew that the collective power of people united by a single goal could change even the most entrenched systems. This gave him hope and confidence that justice, no matter how slowly, would eventually prevail. Michael sat in the locker room after practice, holding his phone in his hand. Lately, his life had been more stressful than ever. The movement for equality that he had led was gaining momentum, but along with it came a targeted campaign against him. Articles and social media posts surfaced, digging into his past mistakes and incidents that Michael had long left behind. It seemed like every aspect of his life, including the moments he didn't want to remember, was being dragged into the spotlight. He felt betrayed and isolated. The sports organizations that once supported him were now sifting through his past, pulling out every minor scandal to discredit his name. Headlines like "Michael, Hero or Hypocrite" began filling the news feeds, questioning his motives and achievements. Michael ran a hand over his face, feeling the exhaustion that had been building up day by day. It seemed like everything he had fought for was crumbling. The words that once gave him strength were now being used against him, making him feel guilty for every mistake he had ever made. He understood that this wasn't just a coincidence, but an organized attack aimed at breaking his spirit and destroying his reputation. "They just can't stand that I'm still going. he said quietly to himself, glancing at his phone as a new notification popped up. Another article, another blow to his reputation. Michael could feel the support around him gradually fading. Those who had once stood by him were beginning to disappear. First, it was his fellow athletes who avoided him after practices, trying to avoid long conversations. Then, strange signals started coming from the sports organizations that had previously been on his side. The support he had felt just a few months ago was slowly turning into silence and distance. He tried to reach out to some of his colleagues to discuss the current situation, but many didn't answer his calls or found excuses to avoid meeting him. This silence was more painful than all the attacks in the media. Inside, Michael felt as if he was being betrayed, not by his enemies, but by those who had once been his allies. One day, after a difficult training session, Michael met with Thomas, his longtime friend and ally. Thomas approached him after practice, and Michael noticed something different in his friend's eyes, something unsettling. "We need to talk," Thomas said as they sat on a bench near the running track. Michael immediately sensed that this conversation wouldn't be easy. "What's going on?" Michael asked cautiously, bracing himself for the worst. "Michael, I know you believe in what you're doing, but I think you've gone too far," Thomas began, avoiding eye contact. "This campaign against you is gaining momentum. People are starting to think that your motives aren't as pure as they seem. You need to be more careful." Michael froze. "Do you think that too? Do you think I've made a mistake?" Thomas sighed. "I just want you to know that many of us are worried. They're not attacking you by accident. They see you as a threat, and if you keep going down this path, they'll destroy you." Michael stared at his friend, feeling a growing divide between them. These words, coming from Thomas, hurt more than any newspaper articles. Michael had always considered Thomas his closest ally, someone who had been with him from the very beginning of this fight. But now, as the attacks intensified, even Thomas was starting to waver. "Do you want me to stop?" Michael asked quietly, trying to hold back the wave of disappointment. Thomas was silent for a few seconds, then nodded. "I think you should step back before it's too late. You've already done so much, but now you're risking everything." Michael felt anger flare up inside him, mixed with pain and desperation. "You don't understand," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "This isn't just about my career. It's bigger than me. If I step back, they'll win. Everyone who believes in equality, who hopes for change, will be left without a voice." Thomas shook his head. "I'm not saying you should give up your beliefs, but you need to understand that your fight is destroying you. People are losing faith in you. They see you not as a hero, but as someone who doesn't know when to stop." Michael slowly stood up, looking at his friend with sadness. "If I stop now, I'll betray everything we've fought for. I'm willing to lose a lot if it's for justice, but I won't betray myself." Thomas stood up as well, but said nothing more. They stood facing each other, and Michael realized that their paths were diverging. This moment marked a turning point in their friendship, and now he knew he was alone in his fight. Michael sat on a bench by the running track, staring at the track ahead. These were his first major competitions after a series of setbacks and media attacks. His competitors were already warming up, preparing for the race, while he felt a heavy weight on his shoulders, as if every step forward was becoming harder and harder. The atmosphere around him was tense, growing more so with every passing hour. Michael knew that this race would be more than just a sporting event for him. It was a symbol of his fight, for equality, for justice, for all the principles that had kept him moving forward despite the numerous obstacles. Over the past few months, he had felt the pressure mounting, threats of disqualification, sabotage, attempts to ruin his reputation. All of it was aimed at one thing, to force him to remain silent, to strip him of his voice. But Michael couldn't and didn't want to stop. He knew that his fight wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had suffered from injustice, who had been judged solely by the color of their skin. His heart was racing, his thoughts were scattered, but he knew one thing. He had to prove not just to himself, but to the world, that the truth could not be silenced. He stood up and looked at his coach, who gave him a nod of support. Michael understood that his journey was just beginning, and this race would be the culmination of his struggle for equality in sports. Michael lined up at the starting line, his muscles tense, his mind focused. In that moment, everything around him, the sounds of the crowd, the glances from his competitors, the comments from the judges, seemed distant. He could only hear the beating of his own heart, feel the weight of each breath. This was his moment, his chance to prove that he wouldn't back down in the face of injustice. As soon as the starting gun went off, Michael took off. From the first steps, he felt every muscle straining, every part of his body responding to the years of training. But this time, it wasn't just the desire to win that was driving him. It was the inner fire, the determination to defeat the system that had tried to break him. His competitors were strong, but Michael felt the fire within him growing. He could hear some of the spectators shouting insults, but he ignored them. Each step was a symbol of resistance and resilience. With every meter, he got closer to the finish line, but also to his ultimate goal. At one point, he felt himself falling behind. His breathing faltered, his muscles ached with exhaustion. One of the competitors tried to shove him, but Michael stayed on his feet, feeling a surge of energy well up inside him. He knew his fight for justice couldn't stop here, on this track. The last few meters of the race seemed like an eternity. Michael could feel his body giving everything it had with each step, but inside him there was a determination that transcended any physical limits. He saw the finish line ahead, heard the roars of the crowd, and in that moment, the entire world seemed to be concentrated in one single instant. When Michael crossed the finish line first, time seemed to stop. He collapsed to his knees, his heart pounding, his breath ragged. Silence filled his mind, and for a moment, he couldn't believe it had happened. He had done it. Despite all the obstacles, despite those who had tried to break him, he had won. Standing up, Michael heard the crowd erupt in cheers. Many of those who had once been against him were now celebrating him as a hero. He knew this victory wasn't just his personal triumph. It was a victory for everyone who had fought for equality, for those who had stood up for justice. Michael stood on the track, looking up at the sky, and felt something change inside him. He had proven not only his strength as an athlete, but his resilience as a human being. This victory was a symbol of a new era in sports, an era where discrimination and bias would no longer go unchallenged. He knew there was still much work ahead, but now he was confident. Truth couldn't be silenced if there was a genuine desire to change the world. Michael sat on a bench by the stadium, staring at the empty track. It had always been his sanctuary, the place where he found peace and strength. But now, as he looked at the track, he felt a strange mix of sadness and determination. His life in sports had come to an end, an intentional decision, one for which he was ready to give up everything he knew and loved. But it also marked a new beginning. He took a deep breath, recalling the past few months. After all the victories and defeats, he had come to the conclusion that the fight for justice in sports was more important than any medal. His movements on the track no longer mattered as much as his movements for equality in society. "Are you sure about this?" a voice said behind him. It was his old coach. He stood nearby, looking at Michael with concern. The coach had always been his rock, but now even he seemed unsure about Michael's decision. "Yes, I'm sure." Michael replied quietly, not taking his eyes off the track. This is bigger than sports. I can't keep ignoring what's happening around me. The coach shook his head, but said no more. He understood that this choice was deeply personal for Michael, and that his athlete wasn't going to back down. Several months had passed since Michael officially retired from professional sports. Instead of training and competitions, he now devoted his time to building his own organization aimed at supporting young athletes facing discrimination. Meetings with activists, developing programs, and creating platforms to fight racism filled his days. Yet, from time to time, he still felt the emptiness, remembering what it was like to run on the track, to compete in races. However, his new path brought different rewards. Michael could see how his actions were starting to change other people's lives. Young athletes came to him for support and advice. Some shared their stories about unfair refereeing, biased coaches, bullying in teams. Michael felt that his struggle had a purpose. "You've inspired so many, Michael," one of his colleagues said, as they discussed plans for an upcoming event. "You've become a symbol for a lot of people who believed their voice didn't matter." Michael reflected on her words. He knew his journey hadn't been easy, but he realized that the sacrifices he had made for the sake of his cause had brought real benefit. However, deep down, he still wrestled with the thought that he would no longer compete. "Now my goal is to make sure every voice is heard," he replied, looking at a list of names of young athletes his organization was helping. A year after founding his organization, Michael prepared for the first international event dedicated to fighting for equality in sports. It was an event that attracted attention not only from the sports community, but also from global media. He knew that this moment was the culmination of everything he had worked for, but now it wasn't just about him, it was about others. The event was attended by athletes, activists, representatives of sports organizations, and journalists from around the world. Michael stood behind the stage, preparing for his speech. His heart beat faster than usual, reminding him of how he used to feel before his first big races. But now, he was more than an athlete. He was the leader of a movement. When Michael stepped onto the stage, the crowd greeted him with applause. He saw young faces in the audience, people who had come to hear him speak. His heart filled with pride and resolve. Now his words carried weight, not only for him, but for thousands of people who were hoping for change. "I stand before you today, not just as an athlete," he began his speech, "but as someone who believes that sports must be a place of justice for all. Our victories on the track are important, but even more important are our victories for equality and justice." His speech was met with a wave of applause and support. Michael felt that he had made the right choice when he left sports for something bigger. Now he knew that his journey was just beginning, and there was still much work to be done. But he was ready to continue.